Black screen. Silence. April 12, 1961. A human being leaves planet Earth for the first time in history. Not an American. A Soviet. The world watches in stunned silence. For a moment, it seems the most powerful nation on Earth isn't Washington. It's Moscow. This nation controlled 1/6 of the Earth's landmass. It commanded the largest army in history. It defeated Hitler when no one else could. It matched America, nuclear weapon for nuclear weapon. And then, 25 December 1991. Jede, Otto Zikipeme. A lone soldier on the Kremlin roof lowers the Soviet flag. It drops. The Russian tricolor rises in its place. Gorbachev signs a single sheet of paper. And in a single afternoon, it is gone. No bombs fell. No army invaded. The most powerful empire of the 20th century simply ceased to exist. 15 nations were born overnight. 25 million people woke up as foreigners in their own homes. An entire ideology that had reshaped the world was declared dead. So how? How does a superpower that put a man in space, that survived Hitler's onslaught, that held half the world in its grip, collapse from the inside? The answer involves economics, ideology, ego, and a fatal flaw baked into the empire's foundation. This is the empire that devoured itself. The complete history of the Soviet Union. This isn't just history, it's a lesson in economics, power, and geopolitics. The Soviet Union lasted just 69 years. From its violent birth in 1922 to its quiet death in 1991, it was history's greatest experiment in state-controlled society. And it failed, spectacularly. Act 1. The Bloody Birth. To understand the Soviet Union, you have to understand the rotting empire it replaced. In the early 1900s, Russia was a nation of extremes. The Tsar lived in gold-encrusted palaces while peasants starved in medieval conditions. Children as young as 8 worked factory floors. Then came humiliation. In 1905, Japan, a nation European powers openly mocked as inferior, crushed the Russian military at every turn. The myth of Tsarist invincibility was shattered. The 9th of January, 1905. Bloody Sunday. Starving workers marched peacefully to the Winter Palace. They carried icons. They sang hymns. The Tsar's soldiers opened fire. Men, women, and children fell dead in the snow. That night, the priest who led the march wrote, "There is no God anymore." There is no longer a Tsar in the hearts of the Russian people. The revolution had begun. In the coffeehouses of Europe and the frozen camps of Siberia, a radical named Vladimir Lenin was waiting. His idea was simple and electric. A professional revolutionary party, small, disciplined, ruthless, could seize power when the moment came. His group called themselves the Bolsheviks, the majority. That moment arrived with World War I. Russia sent 12 million men to the front, poorly armed, worse led. At the Battle of Tannenberg alone, 100,000 Russian troops died. By 1917, food prices in the capital had risen 300%. The war that was supposed to unite Russia tore it apart. In February 1917, bread riots in Petrograd became revolution. When Nicholas ordered the army to suppress the uprising, the soldiers joined the protesters instead. On the 15th of March 1917, Nicholas II abdicated. 300 years of Romanov rule ended in a single signature. Germany, calculating that a revolutionary Russia would quit the war, smuggled Lenin home in a sealed train. Lenin stepped off at Finland Station with the simplest and most dangerous slogan in history. Peace, land, bread. 3 words. 3 promises. An exhausted, starving nation was sold. On the 25th of October 1917, Lenin's Red Guards seized the telegraph offices, the railway stations, the power plants. The provisional government ministers were arrested in the Winter Palace. Lenin stood before the Congress of Soviets and declared, "We will now build socialism." But power seized is not power held. What followed was one of history's bloodiest civil wars. Red Army against White Army. Communists against monarchists, liberals, and foreign expeditionary forces from 14 nations, including the United States. In July 1918, in a basement in Yekaterinburg, Tsar Nicholas II, His wife, his children, even the family dog, were executed by firing squad. The Romanov line was erased in a single night. 7 million dead in the Civil War. On the 30th of December 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was officially declared. The USSR was born in blood. Act 2. The Stalin Paradox. Lenin died in 1924. He left behind a fragile state and a power vacuum. The man who filled it was not the brilliant theorist Trotsky. It was a quiet bureaucrat from Georgia, Joseph Stalin. Stalin understood something the others didn't. Real power doesn't come from speeches. It comes from controlling who gets hired, promoted, and fired. By the late 1920s, Stalin had placed his loyalists in every key position in the party. His rivals were exiled, then erased. Then came the transformation. Stalin announced the 5-year plans. The Soviet Union, a nation of peasants and wooden plows, would become an industrial superpower in a single decade. Steel mills rose in Magnitogorsk, tractor factories in Stalingrad, hydroelectric dams across the rivers of Siberia. Industrial output rose 300%. But the price was paid in human lives. Think of collectivization this way. Imagine the government walking onto every farm in America, seizing every cow, every plow, every acre, and merging them into one giant state corporation. Farmers who resisted were shot, deported, or starved. In Ukraine, the breadbasket of Europe, Stalin's grain quotas left nothing behind. The Holodomor. The terror famine. 3 to 5 million Ukrainians starved to death while grain was exported to fund industry. Then came the purges. Between 1936 and 1938, Stalin turned on his own party. Old Bolsheviks, generals, scientists, poets were dragged before show trials. They confessed to absurd crimes after weeks of torture. Then they were shot. At the peak of the Great Terror, 1,000 executions per day. A vast network of labor camps stretched across Siberia. The Gulag. 10 to 15 million died in famines and purges. And yet, when Hitler's tanks came, it was this brutal, industrialized state that would save the world. Act 3. Clash of Titans. In August 1939, the world watched in disbelief. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, sworn ideological enemies, signed a non-aggression pact. Secret protocols carved up Eastern Europe between them. 2 years later, Hitler betrayed Stalin. The 22nd of June 1941. Operation Barbarossa. 3 million German soldiers, the largest invasion force in human history, smashed across the Soviet border. In Leningrad, the Germans surrounded the city and tried to starve it into submission. 872 days. The siege of Leningrad. 1 million civilians died of cold and hunger. People ate wallpaper paste. They ate leather. In some cases, they ate the dead. But the city did not fall. Then came Stalingrad. Block by block, building by building, room by room, the German Sixth Army was annihilated. The tide of the war turned in the rubble of a single Soviet city. When the war ended, the Soviet Union had lost 27 million lives, 14% of its entire population. No nation has ever paid a higher price for victory. Stalin died in 1953. In 1956, his successor, Nikita Khrushchev, stood before a closed session of the Communist Party. For 4 hours, he detailed Stalin's crimes. The murders, the purges, the cult of personality. Delegates fainted. Some had heart attacks. The god had been declared a monster. But the system that produced him remained. In 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin orbited the Earth. For a brief electric moment, the future seemed to belong to communism. Then, October 1962, Cuba. For 13 days, the United States and the Soviet Union stood at the edge of nuclear war. The world had never been closer to ending. It would never be that close again. After Khrushchev came Leonid Brezhnev. 18 years of stagnation. Corruption became the system. Party officials lived in luxury, while ordinary citizens waited hours in line for bread. The arms race with America consumed up to 20% of Soviet GDP. Resources poured into missiles, tanks, and submarines that would never fire a shot. In 1979, Brezhnev invaded Afghanistan. It would become the Soviet Union's Vietnam, a decade-long bleeding wound that drained the treasury and shattered the myth of the invincible Red Army. The empire was rotting from within. It just didn't know it yet. Act 4. The Collapse. In March 1985, a 54-year-old reformer became General Secretary, Mikhail Gorbachev. He inherited a dying empire. The economy was stagnant. Shelves were empty. The war in Afghanistan was lost. Gorbachev launched two ideas that would unravel everything. Glasnost, openness. Perestroika, restructuring. Think of perestroika this way. Imagine trying to change the engine of a car while driving 80 miles per hour down a highway. That is what Gorbachev attempted. And the car began to come apart. Then, the 26th of April, 1986, Chernobyl. A nuclear reactor exploded in Soviet Ukraine. For days, the regime lied. To its own citizens. To the world. When the truth finally leaked out, something fundamental broke. The Soviet people stopped believing. In Poland, the Solidarity movement rose. In the Baltics, 2 million people joined hands across 3 nations in a human chain demanding independence. November, Sabina, 1000, Simblan Rotis, Tilapan 27. The Berlin Wall fell, not under fire, under the pressure of ordinary people who simply walked through. The Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe collapsed in a matter of weeks. In August 1991, hardline communists attempted a coup against Gorbachev. A defiant Boris Yeltsin climbed onto a tank outside the Russian parliament. He read a declaration of resistance. The coup collapsed in 3 days. But so did the authority of the central state. 25 December 1991. Jede, Otozikipeme. The Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. Gorbachev resigned on television. 15 new nations appeared on the world map. An empire that had taken 74 years to build vanished in a single evening. Act 5. Modern Echo. What followed was not freedom. It was chaos. Western economists prescribed shock therapy. Imagine teaching someone to swim by throwing them into the ocean during a storm. That was the prescription for 290 million people. Inflation hit 2,500%. Life savings evaporated overnight. Factories closed. Pensions vanished. A small group of insiders seized control of state assets at fire sale prices. The oligarchs were born. Russian male life expectancy dropped by 6 years in a single decade. Out of this wreckage, in 1999, rose a former KGB officer, Vladimir Putin. He promised one thing: to restore Russian greatness. In 2014, he annexed Crimea. In 2022, he invaded Ukraine. The ghosts of the Soviet collapse are still shaping our world. Sociologists describe a phenomenon called Homo Sovieticus, a psychological type forged by 70 years of state control, distrustful of institutions, nostalgic for order, suspicious of freedom itself. The Soviet Union promised equality. It delivered a privileged party elite, living in walled compounds while workers stood in breadlines. It promised peace. It delivered Afghanistan, the Gulag, and the constant shadow of nuclear war. It promised to abolish history. Instead, it became one of history's greatest cautionary tales. As one Russian leader once said, "Those who don't regret the Soviet collapse have no heart. Those who want it back have no brain." The empire that devoured itself is gone, but the lessons it left behind about power, ideology, and the gap between promise and reality are still being written. This has been Think Ledger. History isn't the past. It's the operating manual for the present. If this story moved you, subscribe. We have more.